Welcome to Hearts of Scripture, where ancient words come alive, where every story of the Bible touches the heart and awakens the soul. This is the story told through the eyes of Dante Alighieri, the one who once walked through the depths of the soul and saw the light of heaven within the darkness of humanity. Today I invite you to walk with me through that journey once more, not to hear another sermon, but to live again the pilgrimage of faith, of doubt, and of rebirth. I do not speak from memory, but from the witness of one who has walked, who has fallen, and who has been lifted up. Every word I speak is the ashes of doubt and the fire of grace. This is not only an ancient story, it is the story of every soul still wrestling between light and shadow, between the cry of the heart and the silence of God. Listen not only with your ears, but with your soul. There is something strange in human nature that when the storm descends, we call everyone except the one who can calm the sea. I have seen myself do the same. When fear surrounded me, I went to friends, I wrote letters, I reached for those whose words were warm and whose eyes carried understanding. But I did not kneel. I called the world before I called heaven. I remember one night when the wind roared above the roofs of Florence and the candlelight trembled. In my heart there was an emptiness so vast that every piece of advice fell into it without an echo. I opened my notebook and wrote hundreds of questions, but not one of them was directed toward God. When morning came, I realized I was not weary from the storm, but from trying to be my own God. I lived on borrowed wisdom, drinking from the streams that flowed from other mouths, and I thought it was truth. But like the Israelites in Scripture, I too demanded for myself a visible king. I wanted a voice I could easily hear, an immediate answer, a control that fit my desire. They said to Samuel, "Give us a king like the other nations," and God let them have what they wanted, along with the consequences they did not. So did I, in a world flooded with noise. I chose the voice of men over the voice of God. I built for myself a kingdom of reasoning, of assumed wisdom, of faith placed in mankind. And it collapsed like sand. There were nights when I walked through the city under the rain, hearing the crowded conversations in taverns, each person speaking of what they believed, and I found myself in a sea of voices, yet still alone. None of us truly asked God. We asked each other about him, but we did not speak to him. I came to understand that the longing of the human heart is not to find answers, but to keep control. We do not want to know the will of God. We want him to agree with ours. But prayer is not control, it is surrender. When I knelt down for the first time after many years, the room was so silent that I could hear the sound of my own breath. And in that silence, I realized the whisper did not come from the wind, but from deep within the soul. It said, "Ask before you act. Seek before you speak." From that moment, I knew that what had drained me was not the silence of God, but my failure to ask. I had lived by advice instead of by prayer. I had listened to the world and forgotten to listen to heaven. And that was when I began to understand that the first call does not come from man, but from the Creator himself, waiting for us to lift the receiver of the soul and say, "Lord, I am here." Have you ever wondered why we still feel thirsty? Even while living in a world overflowing with information, knowledge, and countless voices, I once thought that if I could just read one more book, listen to another sermon, or find the right advice, the thirst in my heart would finally be satisfied. But the farther I went, the more I realized that not everything that glitters is water, and not every stream flows from the living spring. Hello, my friend. Thank you for still being here with me, and listening to words that may echo within your own soul. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something simple. When was the last time you felt your soul truly dry? When you prayed and felt nothing? When you tried to love but had no strength left? Or when you heard many beautiful words, yet your heart remained silent? Share it with me in the comments below. If you have ever known such moments, that is how I know I am not speaking alone. That on the other side of this screen, there are souls listening, souls that thirst, as I once did, for someone who creates content like me. The most precious thing is not numbers, but your real presence, the presence of someone seeking peace again. Thank you for not leaving halfway through. No, let us continue. I still remember the first image when I stepped into that valley, where cracked wells lay silent beneath the sun. The water within them was once clear, but now only dampness and shadow remain. Those who passed by still bent down, scooping handfuls of sand, thinking they were quenching their thirst. Some called it wisdom. Some called it success. Some called it reality. But in my eyes, it was the tragedy of the soul. I met a woman named Miriam, who once believed that peace came from doing many good things. Every day she wrote down her list of kind deeds, prayed faithfully toward others, and cared for those in need. But when I asked if she could still hear God's voice within, she fell silent. Her eyes looked weary, like one who had carried water from a dry well. I met another man named Caleb, who built an empire with intellect and strength. He spoke of God as if he were a moral principle, not a living presence. He said, I have read every philosophy and learned how to control my mind. Yet when night fell in his large house, his silence sounded heavier than the wind. They were two different faces of the same story. They were not rebelling against God. They had simply stopped depending on him. They did not renounce their faith. They only let it rest like an unopened book. And to me, they were like the Israelites. In the words of Jeremiah, those who had forsaken the spring of living water and dug for themselves broken cisterns that could not hold water. I looked around and saw that we today are not so different. We replace scripture with motivational posts, prayer with podcasts, stillness with to-do lists. We call it growth, but it is a subtle form of dryness. Everything seems useful. Yet, when night comes, we still lie awake, restless, feeling a nameless emptiness. Perhaps you have felt that too. Trying to fill your heart with plans, with work, with fleeting joys, and still finding something missing. If you understand that feeling, write it below in the comments. Just one word. I understand, because when you say that, you are speaking for hundreds of others. Souls who are also learning to return to the true spring. Do not be ashamed of your thirst. Thirst is a sign of life. God does not condemn those who thirst. He only grieves when we drink from the wrong wells. And I believe that even now, he is quietly inviting you to return to the spring of living water, where the flow never runs dry, where the thirst no longer needs to hide in the noise of the world. When I left the valley of the cracked wells, the road led me to a city without night, where artificial light made people believe they no longer needed the sky. There, everyone spoke, debated, and advised, yet no one listened. I heard the sound of conversations echoing across rooftops, where people spoke not to seek truth, but to prove themselves right. And among those voices, I suddenly recognized a familiar sound. My own. I had been the same, believing that if I could gather enough advice from others, I would find the will of God. But advice, no matter how sincere, is still only the echo of human reason, and it can never replace the voice of the Creator. In the center of the city was a wide square where people gathered to share their own versions of truth. Each stood upon a stone step. Speaking with conviction, one said, "Reason is the only light." Another declared, "Experience is the greatest teacher." Yet another shouted, "Kindness is salvation." I looked at them, And in each declaration I heard the echo of Rehoboam, the son who once stood between two kinds of counsel and chose the voice that made him feel stronger instead of the one that called him to humility. Among the crowd I saw a young man, his face bright, his eyes full of longing. He asked me, "How can I know which voice is God's? Who should I listen to?" I answered him with a question. Have you ever knelt down? He hesitated, pressed his lips together and whispered, "I have asked many people, but I have not asked him." I smiled, for I had once been the same. There was a time I thought wisdom meant having many people to ask. I went from person to person, listening to their words about right and wrong. But in the end, my soul felt weary, because some pieces of advice ring like beautiful bells, logical and pleasing, yet they carry no breath of the Spirit within them. I remembered the story in the book of Kings, when Rehoboam ignored the counsel of the elders, those who had served his father Solomon, the wisest of men, and instead listened to his peers. They told him to rule with power, to be harsh, to make the people fear him. And so the kingdom was divided, and advice turned into a blade. Standing in that square, I saw humanity repeating the same scene. Each person builds a circle of friends around themselves, a group of voices that make them feel comfortable, and calls it truth. We no longer seek the word of God, but the affirmation of our own choices. We no longer ask, Lord, what is your will? But Lord, do you agree with mine? And in that, our faith is replaced by pride. I continued walking, leaving the square, passing through streets where windows still shone bright. Behind each glass pane, I saw faces intently, listening to voices from radios. Some nodded, some took notes. I heard them quoting teachers, philosophers, false prophets, those who spoke much about confidence, but never about surrender. They mentioned God, but not with reverence, only as a poetic concept in philosophical language. And I understood advice itself is not wrong, but when it no longer begins with reverence, it becomes lost. At the end of the street stood a small house with its door open and warm light shining out. I stepped inside. An old man sat before a wooden table, holding a worn Bible. He did not speak. He only pointed to a verse. "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God." He spoke in a voice so gentle I almost did not hear it. Wisdom is not passed through the lips of men. It is given down in silence. I stayed and watched as he closed his eyes to pray. And I understood that in a noisy world, the one who can stay silent to hear God is the strongest of all. I left that house carrying a quietness I had never known. On the way back, the square was empty. The words from earlier still echoed faintly, but they no longer felt heavy. I realized that the advice of others can point the way, but only God can open the path. True wisdom does not lie in a number of opinions, but in a heart that bows before the giver of words. And I wondered, perhaps this world is not lacking in advice, but in those who ask him before listening to anyone else. For if Rehoboam had asked, the kingdom might not have been divided. And if we learn that today, perhaps our hearts would cease to be split between reason and faith, between our own will and the will of God. I left the city of counsel and went deeper into the barren land of the soul. The narrow and winding road led me to a palace built of marble, cold and majestic, where sunlight was blocked by heavy drapes. Everything there bore the mark of order and success, but no sign of life. On the throne sat a silent king, his eyes stiff, his trembling hands clutching a silver scepter, tarnished with time. It was Asa, the one mentioned in the old pages, the king who once called upon God and was delivered from an army 1,000 times greater, the one who had been called the restorer of faith. I walked closer. He looked at me like a man who had forgotten how to see. I asked, Do you still remember the first time you knelt down? He was silent for a moment, then whispered. Back then I was weak, and he was strong. Now I am wise enough to protect myself. In his voice I heard not pride, but the weariness of one who had trusted himself for too long. I looked around. His palace lacked nothing. Gold, silver, scrolls, physicians, advisors, but what was most absent was the presence of God. The air was thick, like breath held for too long. On his table lay scrolls recording every strategy, every negotiation with neighboring nations. I realized this was a man who once won battles through prayer, but now tried to win through calculation. I asked, "And when was the last time you prayed?" He avoided my gaze and softly said, "When the great war came, I prayed, but for small matters he need not be troubled." I understood that is the same thought many of us quietly keep, that God should only appear when things exceed our ability. But that thought itself is what decays the soul. For when a person only turns to God in crisis, they have turned him into a tool rather than the source of life. Asa told me he had once witnessed miracles, felt the power of God in the heat of danger. But as the years of peace stretched on, he began to believe that order and discipline alone could preserve prosperity. He replaced prayer with planning, faith with contingency, and slowly he stopped seeking. When a smaller enemy arose, he no longer cried out to God, but used the gold from the temple to hire the king of Syria. The war ended in victory, but his soul had lost long before. For in that victory, God was no longer there. I saw him rub his aching legs, wounds silently consuming him day by day. He said the physicians were treating him, that there was still hope, but I knew his true illness was not in his flesh, but in a heart closed to God. I looked around the palace and saw statues carved in his likeness, depicting him in triumph. Yet even the eyes of stone looked as weary as his own. I understood then there are defeats dressed in glory, souls still standing yet fallen within. I asked, "Do you know why your legs hurt?" He looked at me in surprise. I said, "Because you have forgotten to kneel." My words froze him, but I knew he understood. I left the palace and stepped outside, where cold wind passed through bronze gates. I did not look back, for I did not wish to see again the image of a king once called a man of God. Now, only a shadow of himself upon the throne. I walked through the quiet streets around the palace, where the people still spoke of the king's wisdom, his leadership, the stability he had brought. They did not know that his faith had died, that only habit kept the body moving. I thought of our modern world, where people are much like Asa. We once prayed in poverty, gave thanks when rescued, but when we gained plans, money and tools, we began to believe we could preserve peace on our own. We speak of God, but we no longer ask his will. We rely on books, on data, on numbers, yet forget that every path begins with prayer. I realized Asa's illness is the illness of humanity itself, a refined self-sufficiency disguised under the beautiful name of maturity, and when hardship returns, we blame him for being silent, not knowing we were the ones who locked the door of the prayer room long ago. Before leaving that land, I stood on a hill overlooking the palace. The light from its windows still shone, but dim and faint. I remembered Asa in his youth, when he once lifted his eyes to heaven and said, "Lord, there is none besides you to help the powerless against the mighty." And then God had answered him, but now his eyes looked downward instead of upward. I whispered a prayer for him and for myself as well. "Lord, do not let me become so strong that I no longer need you. For I have learned that victory without you is the most beautiful defeat of hell." After leaving the palace of Asa, I walked westward, where the sky began to pour down a thick shade of grey. as if the very breath of God had grown heavy with disappointment toward mankind. The road led me to a small village at the foot of a mountain, where clay houses stood close together and the sound of church bells rang, not as a call to prayer, but as a familiar ritual that had lost its soul. There I met a man named Saul. He was the image of faded power, a king no longer anointed, wearing a heavy cloak covered in dust, his eyes clouded with fear. I knew his story, as anyone who has read the book of Samuel would know. The chosen one, the anointed, the man granted power, who lost grace by his own impatience and pride. But as I looked at him sitting there, I did not see a sinner. I saw a soul confused and dying slowly beneath the silence of God. I asked him, "Do you remember the last time you heard his voice?" He lowered his head and whispered, "Still pray, but all I see is darkness." I ask, but heaven is silent. I saw his hands trembling, not from age, but from emptiness. He said he had tried everything to hear God again, through dreams, through prophets, through sacrifices, but nothing answered, only a terrifying stillness, as if God himself had turned away. And then he said, "I went to that woman." I knew he was speaking of the witch of Endor. His voice trembled like wind blowing over ashes as he told me how that night he put on common clothes, walked through the darkness, and went to the hidden house behind the hill. He wanted to hear the voice of Samuel, the prophet who had died, the one who had once been the voice of God in his life. But that night, when Samuel's spirit appeared, what he heard was not comfort, but judgment. "Why do you ask me when the Lord has departed from you?" said Samuel. "Tomorrow, you and your sons will die." Saul recounted this with empty eyes, as if he still lived in that moment. The instant when his last hope was extinguished, I looked at him with both sorrow and fear, for I understood he had not turned to darkness because of evil, but because of fear. Fear of silence, fear of being left alone, and in that fear, he had done what so many of us still do: seek answers elsewhere. Simply because we cannot endure the waiting of faith, I stayed silent for a long time, then asked, "Do you think God was truly silent? Or was he waiting?" Saul did not answer. He looked down at the ground, as if listening again to the echo of his own voice in the night. I thought of how often humanity mistakes God's delay for his silence, and so we act on our own, creating our own path, only to lose ourselves deeper in the dark. I had been that person. I had prayed, seen no sign, and thought he did not hear. But perhaps God is not silent to punish, but to see whether we truly need him, or only his answer. Saul did not understand that, and in fear, he turned to what was easier to hear: the voice of the enemy disguised as comfort. In him I saw the reflection of our own age. When God does not respond, people turn to false prophets, those who speak what soothes them, not what changes them. They read short prophecies, look for signs, chase after dreams. Instead of seeking him, I remembered the young people I have met. They do not summon spirits, but they call on energy, on the universe, on destiny. They speak of light, but not of God, of belief, but not of surrender. And like Saul, they think that if they cannot hear the voice of God, they will make their own. But every man-made echo leads only to emptiness. Saul said that when he left the woman's house, the sky seemed to collapse. The next morning, he went to battle, and the prophecy was fulfilled. He fell upon his own sword. It was not the enemy who killed him, but his loss of strength to believe. I stood there, looking at the ruins of the house where he once lived. Now, only a heap of stones. The wind blew through the crack, making a sound like the sigh of a wandering soul. I understood that what killed Saul was not his sin, but his despair at being unable to bear the silence of God. There is a kind of faith that lives only when God speaks and dies when he is quiet. But true faith begins in that silence. I kept walking, heavy-hearted. I thought to myself, of all of us, those who pray only to receive an answer, not to encounter him. And I understood often God does not speak, not because he is distant, but because he is teaching us what Saul never learned, that sometimes silence is the language of trust. I left the land where Saul had fallen, carrying within me the haunting weight of God's silence. The road ahead blurred in the mist, as if the world itself were trying to hide what the human soul could not bear to face. I walked on until the earth opened into a deep valley, and there I saw two paths crossing, one leading upward to the mountain, the other descending into the abyss. On the first path stood people holding torches, waiting, their eyes lifted toward heaven, not in haste, only in silence and prayer. On the second path was a frantic crowd, clutching maps, shouting, chasing after the false light of oil lamps running dry. I knew then I had reached the crossroad where the soul must choose between waiting and saving itself. At that crossroad, I met Saul again, but not the Saul of old, rather a spirit bearing the faces of many living in our time. They were no longer kings, no longer seated on thrones, but they carried the same wound, the wound of those who once believed yet no longer knew how to believe. A woman came near me. She said she once prayed for her sick child, and when the child died, she stopped praying. She said, "I still believe that God exists, but I do not believe. He still cares." Her voice was calm. As if speaking of someone long gone, I said nothing, for no word was enough. I only thought, these are the descendants of Saul, those who still keep his name on their lips, but have buried their faith deep in their hearts. I left her and walked on, finding a ruined temple. Inside, a man knelt before an empty altar with no statue, no candles, only ashes. He said, "I once believed that if I kept the law, if I was good, he would speak, but I kept it." And he was still silent. "So what is the point?" I looked at him. And for a moment, I saw myself in his eyes, the eyes of one who had traded faith for reason. I said, "Perhaps he does not speak, not because you are wrong, but because you have not yet become still." He gave a coarse laugh, rough and bitter. "How can I be still when my heart is like the sea?" I answered. "The sea can only reflect the sky when it stops its waves." He fell silent, and I left, knowing such words cannot be understood in a single day. I walked to the end of the valley, where wind came down from the mountain. There I met a young man named Eliab. He said he had been called, had received prophecy, had been told that God would use him, but year after year, nothing happened, and his heart grew tired. He said, "I do not reject him, but I will do good on my own. If he wills, he will bless it." I asked, "Do you still pray?" He answered, "I do not have time. I am busy doing what is right." That sentence struck my heart like a cold blade. I understood then, nothing is more dangerous than replacing obedience with goodness. For when we do good without doing it for him, even good becomes hollow. I said to Eliab, "The greatest danger is not forgetting God, but remembering him only when convenient." He was silent. He continued, "You call it maturity, but it is a form of pride. You have learned how to act, but forgotten how to kneel. His eyes reddened, and he said, "But he does not speak. I have waited. I have asked, but there is nothing." I answered, "You are searching for an answer, while he is trying to give you his presence. When a person prays only to know, they will never see, but when they pray to be near, he is always there." When I finished speaking, the wind rose. Eliab said nothing more. He simply sat down, looking toward the mountain. I knew the seed had been sown. I left, my heart full of thought. I thought of Saul, of the woman, of the man before the empty altar, of Eliab. All shared the same illness, the weariness of souls, tired of waiting. But faith is not a feeling, it is loyalty in silence. I understood that what caused Saul's fall was not the sin he committed, but his refusal to let God remain God, even when he did not understand him. We want to control how he speaks and when he speaks, and when he does not, we call it failure. Yet sometimes silence is his way of victory, to break our will, to burn away our pride, to teach us that prayer is not a spell. When I left that valley, the wind had calmed, the sky grew clear, and far away I heard the sound of water flowing. I followed the sound, for I knew that after every season of silence, there is always a spring waiting for those who did not leave before they could hear it. As the sound of the stream grew clearer, I came upon a land where light and shadow mingled like two parallel rivers. There I found people who no longer ran from God, yet no longer sought him either. They lived in a kind of false peace, a calm that did not come from faith, but from the numbness of the soul. They no longer asked why God was silent, for they had grown used to his silence as part of life. They went to church as to a ritual, recited prayers like repeating a script, sang hymns as if they were music, not a cry of the heart. And what frightened me most was not their sin, but their calmness. I saw a man sitting on his porch, fingers running through his rosary, lips murmuring prayers, but his eyes stared into nothing. I asked what he was thinking. He said, "I am not thinking of anything, just doing my part." I asked, "Do you believe God hears you?" He replied, "If he wants to, he hears. If not, I have still done my duty." That sentence was colder than unbelief. It was dead faith, still shaped like faith, but without breath. I walked on and came upon a small church in the middle of a field. Inside, a few people were singing. Their voices rose faintly, not out of sorrow, but because they no longer expected anything. I remembered the words in Revelation that God despises no one more than the lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, merely existing. And I understood I was standing among a generation of lukewarm souls, not because they did not know God, but because they knew too much. They had theories, philosophies, theologies, podcasts, and videos on how to pray. Yet the more they knew, the farther they drifted. They did not sin by action, but by self-satisfaction. I sat at the back of the church, looking at the painting on the wall, a shepherd calling his flock, while the sheep stood still. I thought, perhaps they hear, but no longer respond. And I realized hardness of heart is not when man resists God, but when he still approaches him without opening his heart. I left the church at dusk, the red light spreading across the fields. And in that moment, I felt I was seeing the soul of the world. Beautiful, orderly, but empty. I thought of myself of the times. I too had walked in such silence, doing what was right without passion, speaking words of faith, while my heart had grown cold. I understood then the most subtle illness of all, the soul weary of believing we do not betray God, but we no longer love him as before. I continued walking until I saw an old woman watering plants beside a well. Her face was marked with wrinkles like dry roots, yet her eyes shone like fire. She invited me to sit and poured me a cup of water. I asked why she still believed when the world no longer called upon him. She smiled and said, "Because I have lived long enough to know he still speaks. Only people no longer listen." I asked, "How does he speak?" She replied, "By being silent." I looked at her and saw in her stillness a strength I did not have. She said, "Faith does not die from God's silence, but from the silence of the human heart. People pray like sending letters, but never stay to hear the reply." I asked, "How can one hear?" She said, "By staying longer than fear, longer than doubt, longer than the desire for comfort." Then she looked at me and asked, "Have you ever prayed not to ask, but simply to be present?" Her question kept me quiet for a long time. I realized I had prayed like a transaction, used to waiting for answers, used to wanting to know. I had never just stayed and let silence speak for me. I asked her, "What if he never speaks?" She smiled. "When he is silent, it means he is sitting beside you." I looked into the water in the well and saw my reflection blurred. I realized I had been asking to see God without knowing that the very desire to see had clouded my vision. She stood up and said, "This water is not deep, but whoever waits will see the bottom. Faith is the same." I thanked her and went on my way. As night slowly covered the land, I still heard her voice reciting scripture, steady and calm, like breathing. I understood then that souls like hers, quiet, patient, unseen, are the ones keeping this world from running completely dry. As I walked away, a soft wind rose, and I realized the silence of God was no longer frightening. It was not an absence, but an invitation, a wordless call that only those still enough to listen could hear. And in that listening, they would hear the whole sky. I left the village of the lukewarm souls as night began to fall. The road ahead was lit by oil lamps, each flame flickering weakly, like the remnants of faith still trembling in the hearts of men. I walked on until I heard the distant sound of thunder, not violent but heavy, like the breath of the earth itself. When I lifted my eyes, the sky split open with streaks of lightning, revealing a city in the distance, its high walls gleaming and its iron gates shining bright on great golden plaques hanging across the entrance. I read the words, Center of Knowledge, Institute of Spiritual Guidance, Academy of Instant Solutions. I realized I was standing in the age of answers, where mankind could find everything except truth. I passed through the gate, walking among polished stone streets lined with glass towers that gleamed as though night no longer existed. Along those streets, people did not bow their heads in prayer, but before the glow of their screens, I saw hundreds of faces bent low, eyes fixed on small devices, fingers moving endlessly, as if turning prayer beads. But this was not devotion. It was searching. They typed into the blank fields the deepest questions of the soul. Why do I have no peace? Is God real? How can I stop feeling alone? And they received thousands of answers, brilliant but cold. I came near a young woman, her face weary yet determined, the face of one still searching. She asked her screen, "How can I overcome pain?" A mechanical voice replied, "Believe in yourself." She nodded, smiled faintly, then asked, "How can I forget someone I love?" The voice answered, "Time will heal you." She closed her eyes as if those words were a new scripture. I looked at her and saw humanity itself, longing not for the truth that transforms, but for words that comfort. I left her and walked deeper into the city. On the great wall before the central tower, I saw a phrase engraved, "Knowledge is the light that guides." I thought, that light shines brightly. But from where Perhaps it is only the reflection of the fire they have lost. I entered the tower. The vast hall was filled with voices. In the center stood an altar of glass. There was no Bible, no cross, only a mirror. Those who came did not come to worship, but to see themselves. I saw faces reflected in the glass, each repeating the same prayer, grande happiness, but none said, Lord, make me faithful. I realized this was the world of Ahaziah, the king who fell from his balcony and sought not God, but sent messengers to ask Beelzebub whether he would live. And I heard again the question of the prophet Elijah, is there no God in Israel that you must inquire of Beelzebub? Humanity now walks the same path, only their idols no longer bear monstrous forms, but wear the faces of data. Advice and human knowledge. I saw a group of young people gather around the table. They spoke about the meaning of life, about positive energy, about the power of the universe. They spoke of faith, but never said God. They spoke of grace, but called it good energy. They spoke of prayer, but renamed it energy meditation. I stood and listened. They were sincere, but lost. A young man turned to me and asked, do you have faith? I said, I do, but not in myself. He frowned. Then, what is your faith? I answered, it is surrender. He laughed. That is weakness. I replied, to be weak before God is the only way to be strong before darkness. He said nothing, but I knew he did not understand. For in this world, strength is exalted and surrender is despised. I left the group and climbed to the top of the tower. From above, the city shone like an artificial heaven. But I knew beneath that light was an abyss. I saw people living in a sea of information, yet dying of thirst. They had every answer, but no longer heard the voice of God. I remembered the ancient words, my people perish for lack of knowledge, but now they perish not for lack of knowledge, but from the abundance of what is meaningless. I looked up to the sky where thunder still rolled in the distance, and I knew God had not been forgotten, only replaced. Humanity had not denied him, only lowered him to the level of an option. I left the tower, passing through the crowds kneeling before their screens. I whispered, is there no God in Israel? But no one heard. I understood that silence was no longer the teaching of God, but the result of man no longer asking him. As I stepped through the gate, the artificial light faded behind me, and rain began to fall. The rain washed the dust from the earth, but not the dryness from human hearts. I lifted my face to the sky and whispered, Lord, teach this world to thirst again. For only when the soul learns to thirst will it find its way back to the living water. I left the city of knowledge in heavy rain, each drop falling on the ground like the sigh of God over the wandering souls of mankind. The road led me into a dark plain where thunder still rumbled in the distance. But lightning no longer gave enough light to guide the way. There I saw scattered tents, dim fires flickering weakly, and in their pale glow I recognized faces, people who once believed, once prayed, but now lived only on the memory of faith. They no longer wrestled with sin, but with emptiness. I approached one of the fires where a small group sat together. A young man said, I no longer hear God, yet I still go to church. I read the Bible, but it is only words. I pray, but it is only sound. Another spoke, I once heard him in dreams, but now there is only silence. I think he has left me. They spoke like wanderers in a desert, using words as water, yet the more they spoke, the thirstier they became. I listened, not with my ears, but with memory, for I had been one of them. I knew the feeling when prayer becomes habit, when faith becomes form, when the soul no longer trembles before holiness, but only longs for peace. I asked them, do you know why you no longer hear God? One answered, because our faith is weak. I shook my head. No, because you have filled the space where he wants to speak. They looked at me, surprised. Y continued. God does not speak in noise. He speaks in stillness. But you fear silence. So instead of waiting, you fill it with sound, with voices, with music, with the wind, even with worry. He still speaks, but no one stays still enough to listen. A woman began to weep. She said she had prayed for years for her husband to return, but now she only prayed for her heart to grow hard. I told her, a hardened heart is not healing. It is the slow death of the soul. She fell silent, then asked me, what should I do? I answered, learn to hurt without leaving him. Her tears mixed with the rain, but in her eyes I saw a small flame being rekindled. I rose and walked deeper into the night and found another man kneeling beside a rock. He prayed aloud, voice trembling, Lord, why are you silent? Why can I hear nothing? I came near and placed my hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes wild. I asked, have you ever prayed without speaking? He stared, confused. Pray without words? What is that? I said, it is letting him speak. It is when you stop listening with your ears and begin listening with your soul. He said nothing. He continued, you have turned prayer into a one-sided conversation. You speak endlessly, but never give him time to answer. And he has been waiting. I thought of Job, who cried out in the ashes, asking God why. And God replied, not with comfort, but with power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Then Job stopped asking, for he understood the purpose of faith is not to understand everything, but to keep kneeling even when you do not. I told this to the man. He was silent for a long time, then whispered, I am afraid of silence. I said, every fragile soul fears silence, for silence is where God dwells and man has no control. But if you have the courage to remain in it, you will hear him not with your ears, but through peace. I left him in that stillness and walked on. That night I walked until I came upon a low hill where the wind carried the scent of wet soil and burned grass. On the hilltop stood a small stone house with no door, only a narrow slit of light. I entered and saw an old man sitting beside an oil lamp. He said, I lived all my life among the voices of men, and I only heard God when every sound had gone. I asked, what did he say to you? He smiled, nothing. But when he came, I no longer needed an answer. The words were simple but sharp as a blade. I understood that many live their lives searching for answers, but only those who surrender find his presence. I looked at the lamp before me. Its small flame, steady and enduring. It did not shine brightly, but it did not die. Like true faith, I asked him, why does your lamp never go out? He replied, because I do not blow hard. I simply keep still. I watched that light for a long time and whispered, perhaps faith is not a loud shout, but the quiet breath that keeps the flame alive. When I left the house, the rain had stopped. The sky was still filled with clouds, but between them, a thin line of light appeared like a wound in the dark. I knew dawn was coming, and I understood God is never silent forever. He only waits until the soul stops complaining long enough to hear the sound of his own footsteps. Dawn broke, and the first light cut through the mist like a sword from heaven, thin and sharp, piercing every dark corner that still lingered in my mind. I stood on the hill where I had spoken the night before with the old man beside the oil lamp, and for the first time after many days of wandering, I heard birds singing, not as sound but as a call to awaken. I looked down into the valley below, once covered in darkness and rain, now flooded with light that glistened on every stone and drop of dew. I felt something strange within me, not excitement, but peace, a peace stronger than any storm. deeper than any answer. I began to understand what I had been searching for all along without knowing its name. It was not the voice of God, but the ability to remain in his silence without walking away. As I descended the hill, I met a young man standing by a river. He looked troubled, holding a crumpled letter in his hands. He said, "I have asked God to show me the way. I have asked again and again, but he will not answer. I am about to choose a direction at random because this silence is driving me mad." I looked at him and asked, "What if he has already spoken, just not with words?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the river before us, where the water flowed endlessly, striking the rocks, turning, and still moving forward. Sometimes his silence is not absence, but invitation. I said, "He does not always guide with words, but with movement. Look closely. The water never asks the rock to move. It simply flows and the rock steps aside." He looked at the water for a long time, then let the letter fall into the river. The paper grew wet, dissolved, and I saw his face soften. I said nothing more, for I knew that lesson can only be understood by living it. I walked along the river bank, and through the thinning mist I saw another city, smaller, humbler, resting in the plain. There were no high walls, no golden signs, only low houses, and at the center a wooden temple. I stepped inside. A few people were praying. No one shouted. No one wept. No one performed. Only breathing, rhythm, and sunlight filtering through the roof. I sat in a corner and listened. A man stood and read from the scriptures, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Be still and know that I am God." When he finished, no one clapped. No one reacted, only silent. But I felt the weight of those words fill the room like warm water seeping into the cracks of dry souls. I bowed my head, closed my eyes, and saw again every face from my journey. Asa with legs that never knelt, Saul lost in fear, the lukewarm praying out of habit, those who sought God through the wisdom of men. All of them, all of us, is suffering the same illness, the illness of souls that forget God is not to be understood but to be worshipped. I opened my eyes and saw light spilling through the doorway. I rose and stepped outside, where a woman sat before the temple, weaving a woolen cloth. I asked, "What are you doing?" She replied, "Mending the threads that have broken." Why? I asked. She smiled, because even when torn, they still belong to the same fabric. I stayed silent, knowing she was not speaking only of wool, but of people, of souls who think they have fallen away from God, yet still belong to Him, needing only one thread of faith to be woven back. As I left the temple, I saw a road leading straight toward the horizon. There were no cities, nor temples, nor voices, only gentle light and the sound of wind. I walked, no longer afraid of silence, no longer needing signs. I knew faith was not seeing the light, but walking in the dark, because the light exists. I remembered the words of the old man by the lamp, that God does not speak with human language, but with presence. And now I felt Him everywhere, in the water, in the wind, in my own breath. I realized that all the questions I had carried through this journey, why is God silent? Why does He not show the way? When will He speak? Had all been answered, not by words, but by the journey itself. For true faith is not in the answer, but in continuing to walk even when there are none. I stopped and looked up at the wide sky, where light had filled every shadow, and I whispered, "Lord, I have gone far, but never beyond your sight." I understood that He was never silent, only that I was never still enough to hear. And in that moment, I heard something rise within me, not in my ears, but in my heart. A voice without words, yet I understood every meaning. Stay, I knelt, not out of fear, but because I knew I was home, not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a life that listens. In the light of morning, I closed my eyes, and for the first time, silence became holy. When I look back on my whole journey, from the radiant cities to the barren valleys, from the cries of desperate souls to the deep silence of the old man beside the oil lamp, I realized that every step, whether lost or steadfast, was part of the path leading back to God, not a return through knowledge, nor through success, but through surrender. I have come to understand that the most precious thing is not hearing his voice, but believing that he is there even when he is silent. Faith is not when you hear God speak, but when you keep walking, even when you hear nothing. I have walked among those who seemed strong, yet fell beneath the weight of their own confidence. And I have seen small souls stand firm because they knew how to kneel. I have seen those who searched for God in noise and those who found him in stillness. I have learned that God does not come in thunder or fire, but in a gentle whisper. And within that whisper, he still speaks to every soul willing to listen. I share this story not so you may see me, but so you may see yourself. Sometimes what distances us from God is not sin, but exhaustion. We pray out of duty, live as though faith were a burden. Yet God never asked us to be perfect. He only asked us to be honest. He does not demand understanding, only presence. And if you are hearing these words now, I want you to know that your journey is not over. Each day is a new invitation to pause, to be still, to listen. Perhaps you are in the dark night. Perhaps you are thirsty. Or perhaps you think God has left you. But remember, silence is not absence. It is the language of love, the breath of trust. I have learned that the miracle does not lie in God's reply, but in the fact that I still wait, not because I am patient, but because he is worth waiting for. To you who are listening now, I offer my deepest gratitude. Thank you for walking with me to this point. Through every word, every image, every breath of this story. Thank you for allowing your heart to listen, not only with reason, but with your soul. For someone like me, that is not just joy, but grace. I hope that through this journey, you have not only heard a story, but found a part of yourself within it. If anything in these words has made you pause, has stirred you to pray, or reminded you that God is still waiting for you, then everything has been worth it. I do not speak as one who has found all the answers, but as one still learning to stay, to trust, to be still. And I pray that you too will find that not outside, but in the quiet space between you and God. Because sometimes what you need is not a miracle, but a silence filled with faith. Allow yourself to be still. Let your heart rest in his presence. And when the world around you grows too loud, I remember that you can find God in your very breath. For he has never left. He only waits for you to turn and listen. Thank you for walking with me. Thank you for believing. And thank you for keeping the flame of faith alive within you. No matter how small, no matter how faint, it is enough to light your way, and perhaps the way of someone lost beside you. May peace overflow in your soul. And may the word of God you have heard today walk with you through every step ahead. I pray that you find light in stillness, strength in faith, and rest in his presence. May your home be filled with peace. Give your heart with courage, and your spirit with quiet trust that you are never alone. As you close this video, remember this: God is still beside you in every moment, in every breath. Until we meet again, May you remain strong, gentle, and close to His grace.